you everyone, and good morning to all of you. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, good. First of all, before I start my presentation, many thanks to the organizing this forum, especially to Dr. Peter Pong from Curtin University, who have been in touch with me at the time that this forum was being organized. And my thanks also go to Dr. Arthur Kuhn, who is the director of the Center for Road and Rail Research at the Naresuan University. And I think it's a very, very good thing that a local university has started this focus and started this momentum exactly the same way I started in Wollongong University in the early 1990s. So I think that's the first step and that's the first hurdle, and I think that's a very good symptom for the future. So without taking any further time, I will get on right to the topic. I put some important slides together, practically looking at where we were and where we are now and where we are heading. It's practically with that kind of philosophy. I'm not going to go to the detailed computational and difficult mathematics in this particular presentation. I will touch on it, but without going into detail. But I think at a later stage, some of the PhD students who are here, they can correspond with me in some of those in detail works. Right, so the presentation outline I have is looking at the issues facing the railways currently, and some of the problems that you will see in Australia is common to rest of the world as well. I will look at the scope and objectives of a railway research culture, which is the cooperative research center framework that started all this research in Australia in a cooperative scheme, and I will explain this cooperative scheme in more detail later. The need for high-speed rail. Is there really a need for high-speed rail? If you really need high-speed rail, why do you need that? Is it just for competition with the rest of the world, or is it because the country really needs it? Those are philosophical issues that need to be addressed both politically and socially. The fundamental and applied research. If you are going to modernize the railway tracks, if you are going to do a very good job of these rail tracks, then you can't do trial and error. It's risky. If there is a derailment of a train and there are hundreds of fatalities, you only have to happen once and the entire country will regret. So there has to be research. The governments will have to spend money and give universities that money to do research, because you can't do high-speed rail without doing the background research. Every country is different. Every country has different soil conditions. Every country has different ground problems. So you can't simply copy from Japan or from China and think that we can do that. So I think I will address some of these things in detail as well. Okay, now some of the problems that you see here in railways are common to many countries. Flooding. Now that's a slide where flooding, constant flooding in the state of Queensland in Australia has practically affected railway tracks. If you look at this track, there is no ballast left. The rock particles have been taken away by the floods. If you look at this track here, you can see the differential settlement. And that is because of the very soft soils in the coastal areas. And Thailand is no different. Soft bank of clay is well known in the world. You are going to get settlements of soft soils. And that is what happened at high speeds. Some of the soft soils which is below the track will liquefy under high cyclic loads. No different to what happens during earthquakes. The soil will liquefy at certain speeds and will pump up and pollute the ballast. And then dries up. And this mud clogs the voids of the particles. And when that happens, there is no drainage. And that's what happens here. Now this is a track close to University of Wollongong. The railways can't operate, so all the students have to take buses. Now that's quite common. You can see the amount of water here after the rainfall, because of the tracks are not drained anymore because of this problem. So the tracks have to be abandoned until repairs and maintenance works have to be implemented before the track can operate. Ballast crushing is another problem. At certain speeds, particles start to break up into small particles. And once the particles become smaller and smaller and smaller, then the bearing capacity of the track goes down very quickly. It goes down exponentially because the friction angle of the particles exponentially decreases when the size decreases. So that track is abandoned. If you look at the sides, you can see the particles, but not in the middle of the track. And those particles have been broken. Then we have the problem of coal fouling. Now that's a man-made problem. Coal tracks, coal carriages, when they travel, especially in the state of Queensland in Australia, you fill the wagons too much when the train is stationary. But when the train starts to move, all these big mounds of coal start falling down into the track and then start clogging. And it's the same problem as that now. You don't get drainage after that. Now looking at the statistics of railway things, here I have plotted the rail, roads and port, harbour transport. So if you can look from 1960s to what we are around here now, you will see it is the rail that is increasing at a much higher rate than roads and ports. So this in Australia politically and socially and economically justifies why a lot more effort, a lot more focus and a lot more funding has to be put into rail rather than to roads and ports. Ports seem to be relatively stable because it's not easy to expand harbours everywhere. But rail in a big country like Australia can be made anywhere. You can have shorter routes. So this is what you see. The demand for rail has been increasing significantly, and I believe this is the same situation in most other big countries like US, Canada as well. So just to give some idea of the Australian rail scenario, currently there's a labour force of about 45,000 people in Australian rail. That's employees who are directly employed in railway organisations. And then 70,000 plus people work in industries, both civil, electrical, mechanical and so on, which are providing services for the railways. So altogether, approximately say 120,000 people involved in the employment of the railway-related work. If you look at the amount of funding that Australian government has been spending, 36 billion is investment in commitments for rolling stock and track. Now that's not a huge amount of money. If you really come to think of it, Australia as a big country, in terms of geographical size, it's not a huge amount. But we have only 22 million people in Australia. So in terms of the number of population, that's a very decent funding. Okay. We have 44,262 kilometers of tracks in Australia, which is the second largest in the world. 725 million annual customer journeys. Now for 22 million people, that's a lot of traffic. 853 million tons of freight moved. Being a big country, Australia being a large mining and agricultural country, where a lot of produce from the mines and agricultural produce has to go interstate very quickly, where trains are obviously the best choice. And that's a lot of money for 22 million people. We have 1,800 locals traveling across the country and 32,000 wagons and carriages. So these are statistics from 2012, so this is very recent statistics and increasing as we speak. Now coming to the railway research culture, I think when I asked Dr. Pirupong exactly what he wanted me to talk about, he said that Naniswaran University and other universities want to organize a cooperative research culture and do work on railway research, and whether I can just give some hints as to how I started this in Australia in the 1990s. And that's the cooperation. That is the main key word. The concept of the Cooperative Research Center, CRCs, for rail innovation is currently the biggest cooperative research center in Australia. Before this 7 years ago, about 14 years ago, I was one of the pioneers of the Cooperative Research Center for Railway Engineering. It started in 1999 together with 6 other universities and about 10 different railway organizations. So the cooperative culture, academics can't do it on their own because they don't own railway assets. So you need to get the industry involved. You need to get the railway organizations excited and get them involved. So that's the linking industry with the academia and the need for research. It is not easy to convince, especially the political circles, at least in Australia, that you need to do a lot more in research. Because railways is an area, in many parts of the world, very little money is put in for research. If you look at the amount of money that is put into airports, roads, and harbours, you will find that the railways deserve a lot more than what countries generally spend these days, and that includes Australia. 100 million research program over 7 years is what the CRC railway innovation has brought. Now, of course, this particular railway research center will finish at the end of June in 2014. So what happens after that? Well, obviously, there will be another railway research center, maybe with a different name. Maybe it might be called Cooperative Research Center for Rail Manufacturing. It might be some other name, but the CRCs will continue and we'll get another 7-year funding. So this particular scheme of funding for CRCs is typically 7-year periods. It's easy to get a renewal, so we have got it twice now for 14 years, but to get a third term, we had to convince the Australian government a lot more why we need a third term. So that's what we are currently doing. We have already made the bid to Canberra, and fingers crossed, hopefully we'll get another 7 years from 2014 onwards. The most important thing is the collaboration between industry and the universities in projects that are initiated by industry. It's not the universities that have to tell people, these are the projects that we got to do. The wisdom, the momentum, and the initiatives have to come from industry. The industry has to practically convince the political circles that Thailand railways have got these problems. If we are going to go for high-speed rail, we have to solve these problems first. So these problems have to come from industry. So the academics, what is their role? They have to take the problem, identify the problems, and then they have to decide, okay, what are the solutions? How can we bring solutions in an academical way? How do we use our bright PhD students, our bright research students, thesis students? How do we take these academic challenges and do some good quality research and development work to help industry? Now that's the start of the culture. Committed to address field problems for the Australasian rail industry through applied solutions. We already know that in universities we have some part of research which we call blue sky research or fundamental research, which practically ends up in libraries, in journals and monographs. But industry never use them, they don't even read them. That kind of research will not go anywhere. I'm not saying it's a waste of time. If that kind of research is still good, that's what keeps your brain active. Those are academic research. But what we are looking at here are applied solutions. Solutions that the industry can quickly use. User-friendly solutions. That's what we need to deliver to industry. Okay? Training of personnel through applied research and rail education. What about all those PhD students who do PhDs in railway work? What's the point if they also become professors? Some of these people who get trained in universities doing good quality applied research, they have to join industry. That is the best way of technology transfer. You train some high quality students in Naresuan University, in Mysore University, in Chulalongkorn University, and so on. But some of these students who do this project have to join the railway organization and take those challenges, and that's the best way of technology transfer. So in our CRC railway innovation, there is a commitment by the industry partners who are involved in that. The good graduates who are doing good work will automatically be absorbed into the rail industry at much higher salaries than university academics. Oops. So that's a cross-section of CRC rail engineering. You can see the number of companies, industries, and the universities. That's Queensland University of Technology, that's CQU, Central Queensland University, University of Queensland, Monash University, Southern Cross University, University of Wollongong. So you can see so many universities. I have randomly put this, so I may have missed out a few things. But if you look at the companies, Rio Tinto, Queensland Rail, we have some foreign railway organizations as well, the New Zealand Rail, Rail Canada, Public Transport Authority of Western Australia, New South Wales Rail Corp Transport, Horizon, which used to be Queensland Rail, now they are called Horizon, Australian Rail Track Corporation, practically mainly covering South Australia as part of New South Wales. So all the major railway organizations, plus the universities, plus some invited outside organizations, form the CRC for Rail Innovation. So that's the group, that's the family of the CRC. Right, so what do we do? What is the summary of this? With the transport challenges we have, the volume and movement of freight will double over the next 10 years. I've already showed you the graph, how rail increases compared to roads and port. Port is generally stagnant. See, the biggest competition for rail is actually going to be roads and ports and airports. Because you know these days, the domestic airfares, air tickets are becoming cheaper and cheaper. For $99, you can go from Sydney to Brisbane return ticket. Sometimes for $59, you can fly to Melbourne from Sydney. So the biggest challenges for any new rail network is, what is going to be the cost of the ticket prices? If the airfares are going to come down, the motor authorities are never going to proactively support rail, because if motor authorities like big companies like Holden and Ford in Australia, if they proactively support rail, how can they sell their cars? So you always have the question of whether the other transport organizations are going to proactively support rail. So this is where the correct political decisions will need to be made, and this is where the industry colleagues and academics who are sitting here in this audience will have to strategically make the plans and convincing strategies to influence the political circles. This is why rail is important. And it's not going to be easy, because you are going to get competition from railways, from roads and airfares. So that's the biggest challenge. The congestion and loss of productivity will cost 30 billion in 2050. Now that's an Australian scenario. The congestion and loss of productivity. What does this mean? Well, if the train speeds can't exceed a certain desirable limit by the community, they are going to drive their own cars, or they are going to get into a coach. So the trains, if they operate, have to prove that the congestion is relieved. Now in Australia, because of quite a lot of congestion, there have been loss of productivity, and that has been estimated at 30 billion. And of course that loss of productivity is also because of certain weather patterns. As I showed you some of the problems, sometimes the railways cannot operate during Saturdays and Sundays, and they are closed for repairs. So people have to take road and other forms of transport. So there is going to be loss of productivity. So if railways are going to operate, then there has to be that reliability, no different to the roads. So how can you prove to the community that if railway network is expanded, that they are going to be as reliable as the road network, if not more? Current heavy haul rail inadequate to meet efficient supply chain. As I said, Australia is an agricultural country. We are a mining country. A lot of mining is done in Western Australia and Queensland and part of New South Wales. And most of the biggest international harbours are in New South Wales. So it doesn't matter where the mining is done. It might be Western Australia, it might be in Queensland. But those produce have to be delivered to Sydney Harbour before they are loaded into ships to Japan, for example. So there has to be that quick mode of transport. And we don't have that. Our railway system is totally inadequate to maintain an efficient supply chain. So in Australia, politically we have a big pressure on the government to expand its rail network just to fulfill that inadequacy. Favorable carbon footprint and energy efficient. We expect the trains to be energy efficient. Now trains are very heavy, especially freight trains in Australia. Those of you who have been to Australia get caught to a signal light, you have to wait in your car for 5 minutes before you can go again, because the trains are very long, they are very heavy. Now heavier and longer these trains become, if they are going to be carbon friendly, they have to go at fast speed. Slower the speed is, it's not energy efficient. Right? So if you are going to have long and heavy trains, 35 ton axle trains, in Western Australia now they are making 40 ton axle trains, which will be the heaviest in the world, 40 tons. They have to go at least 150 kilometers per hour. What's the point of a 40 ton axle train going at 80 kilometers per hour? You might as well take the buses, right? Or trucks, if it's freight. So they have to go at high speed because of the mere weight of it. Community expectations. Well, the community is very strange in that sense. They expect, if you ask an average Australian, do you want a high-speed train? They will say, of course we do, because China's got it, Malaysia is going to have it, Korea's got it, so of course we need a high-speed train. Then you can ask them, do you want it to stop by your doorstep? They will say, of course yes, I want to get into the railway station in 5 minutes. But then every person wants a fast train to stop at their doorstep. So how can that be fast? So people have to accept the fact that if a train is going to be fast, you can't stop everywhere. So people have to still be prepared to drive their car or ride their motorbike or the bicycle and go to the nearest railway station where the high-speed train stops. And then people get very disappointed when they say, oh, high-speed train is not going to stop at Wollongong. It's going to bypass Wollongong and go straight from Sydney to Canberra. So then the Wollongong community will say, well, we are not supporting the high-speed train. We are better off the government giving that money for the schools in the Wollongong area. So here is a typical example of the community problem. So we have to address these as well, community expectations. Then we have the skill shortages. It's very easy for someone in the political circle to make a big decision. Well, China's got a high-speed train, Korea's got a high-speed train, Taiwan's going for high-speed train, Thailand is now going to go for high-speed trains. And we can say, well, we must be in competition, we must have high-speed train. But you've got to look at the skill shortages. How can you have high-speed trains if you don't have enough trained people? How are you going to overnight train people? In civil engineering, in Thailand universities, do you teach railway engineering to your undergraduates? Are they academics here? Do you teach railway engineering to civil engineering undergraduates? You don't. Well, in Australia we don't. But I'm sure you teach road engineering. There you go. So you teach road engineering to the undergraduates in civil engineering, but you don't teach railway engineering. So there's no doubt why there's a skill shortages, because a civil engineering undergraduate will only travel in a train. They will not know anything about railway design. Right? Then that's a big problem. But a civil engineering undergraduate, when they graduate, they know how to design a road. They even do harbour. I mean, in our program in civil engineering design, some of my academic colleagues, they even teach harbour design, but they don't teach rail design. And if you try to rail design, some of the road engineering academics say, well, sorry, we don't have enough time to teach that. So you've got to take into account those challenges as well. So design, construction, maintenance and manufacturing, all these have to be taken into account. Harmonization with other transport systems. I mean, you can't fight with other transport authorities, but you've got to amicably somehow harmonize with roads and ports if railway is going to be successful. Because at the end of the day, the railways have to start, for example, with a mining company, and the ore has to be delivered to a harbour, and the support services have to be provided. Okay, now I'm coming to the real research part. This is all philosophical. I just set the scene, both political, social and economic aspects of it, but now I'm coming to the real research part. In railways, my specialty is track and below track. Okay? I'm not a mechanical engineer, I'm not an electrical engineer, so I'm not going to talk about locomotives and how fast the loco can go. That's the electrical and mechanical engineering colleagues. And it's quite easy to convince your mechanical engineering colleagues that don't think it's worthwhile designing trains that can go 500 kilometers per hour because the thing has to still go on the ground. So the geotechnical engineers have to be there to build the tracks, right? There is no point ordering bullet trains from France, the TGVs, to Thailand if the Thai geotechnical engineers are not going to make the tracks. So the track is the first thing, right? So we have ballast, that is the ones that take the load. Now if you look at in Australia, Australian standards are totally inadequate, even for trains to go at 150 kilometers per hour. When I started rail research in 1990s, I was honestly shocked at the way some of the Australian standards were made. I couldn't understand why ballast had to be uniform, like a jar of marbles. Every particle has to be the same size. I couldn't understand this because this defeats all my understanding of soil mechanics. You all know here, those of you are civil engineers, if the particles are all uniform, you can't get sufficient friction. Particles have to be more broadly graded so that you mix the different sizes, they interact better, you get much higher friction. So the Australian standards had to be changed. And it took me more than 15 years to convince the Australian Institute of Engineers that the standards have to be changed. So that shows how conservative the Australian railway engineers are. And I'm not saying this is just for Australia. I know that railway engineers in every single country tend to be very conservative. They don't want to change things around. So new standards, better design and better construction alternatives. You need to look at this in terms of what's available in the local areas. I'm not quite familiar with exactly what ballast that is being commonly used in Thailand, but when I worked at AIT about from 1988 to 1991 as associate professor, I can tell you that Thailand ballast was actually charnokites, there was porphyrite, quartzites, and some igneous rocks like basalts and some granites. They were used, and some rhyolites as well in some parts of Thailand. I think the same type of rock is still currently being used, but the problem is, how long can you quarry good quality ballast? You know that environmental groups are very, very strong these days. They don't want railway engineers to go and blast everywhere. They don't want quarries to be put in everywhere. They will object to this and that. Same in Australia. So there are limited number of places where you can quarry good quality rock. You can't blast anywhere and everywhere. Right? So that's something that you need to look at. Then we have the sub-ballast. What is underneath the ballast? Well, underneath the ballast you can have kind of rubbish rock. You know, things that have been thrown out of tunnels, things that have been thrown out of the mines, what we call waste rock or riprap. So they can be brought in as sub-ballast and compacted, but they still need to have improved filtration and drainage under large cyclic loads. The difference between slow trains and fast trains will be fast trains will be applying these large cyclic loads. Then we have the problem of formation. Now this is something very common between Thailand and Australia. I learned my soft soils when I was actually at AIT because I realized when I came from Canada, I used to be very familiar with boulder clays in Canada, which is very stiff. And when I was in London, it was London clay, which is very stiff. But then I come to Bangkok, I couldn't believe how soft the soil conditions are. So my first experience of soft soils was actually in Thailand. I quickly changed my field. When I went to Australia, I realized, oh my God, in Australia, the soft soils are even worse in some parts. So that's how the formation area became a real critical issue in our research program. One of the real reasons, technical reasons, that Australia can't have a high-speed rail very quickly is because we need to spend a lot of money on ground improvement to improve the shear strength and to reduce settlements of compressible soils in Australia all the way down the eastern coast. Very, very soft soils where undrained shear strength often is less than 10 kPa, 10 kilopascals. That's very soft, that's even softer than Bangkok clay. Rail and sleepers. We got to minimize the impact damage. At high speeds, your concrete sleepers can crack. They can break very quickly. I have seen enough concrete sleepers that have cracked. In fact, this is one of the advantages of timber sleepers. The old-fashioned timber sleepers don't crack in a brittle way like concrete often. Of course, they biodegrade with time, that's a different issue. But they don't crack and break, sometimes like concrete sleepers. Concrete sleepers are easier to make, and these days, of course, you can't cut forests, so there's a limit of how many trees you can cut to make sleepers, so concrete is possibly the way to go. But then you got to design the concrete sleepers to impact damage at high speeds. I'll get on to this later. Now here is the proposed high-speed track in Australia. That's Brisbane, that's Sydney, and then Wollongong just here. Just here is Wollongong, but the high-speed track will not come to Wollongong this area because the soil conditions are terrible here. So you have to go from Sydney to Canberra, and the soil conditions are much better here. So rather than taking this coastal route where the soil conditions are very poor, the idea is to go inwards away from the coast, and they go in a little bit of a roundabout way to Melbourne, because by going through better ground conditions, even though the track is a little longer, the total cost is much less. So that's a typical example of how the governments will make decisions through geotechnical reports and advice given by consultants and experts, that sometimes it's okay for the track to be a bit longer rather than going on the very soft soil conditions. The approach to Sydney can be very, very soft and also highly congested. Therefore, you will have to have tunnels. You can't simply ask towns to vacate. There are quite a large number of small towns. So you can't just have high-speed rail and then these little towns to vacate. So you will have to have tunnels. Same thing at the approach to Brisbane. Very, very heavily congested townships around here. So you will need tunnels, and that's going to add to the cost compared to the surface tracks. There are some pictures here of the type of geogrids and the type of geotextiles that can be put to improve the conditions of ballast and the formation. Vertical drains that need to be driven into the soft soils before the tracks are being put in. Shock mats to absorb the energy from the trains so that the ballast don't crack. I will go through these a little while later. High-speed rail runs at significantly higher speeds than conventional fast trains. Now, conventional trains are normally less than 200 kilometers per hour. The freight trains, the highest speeds in freight trains operate in Western Australia and Queensland in Australia, and they go around 160 kilometers per hour. The fastest in New South Wales around 150. But you can easily go up to 200 kilometers per hour on conventional good quality ballast track. There is no problem. Up to 200, there is no problem. But it is beyond 200 that the conventional rail tracks are not good enough. They will run the risk of derailment if you exceed the speed more than 200. So we are talking about 350 kilometers per hour. This 350 is about a good number. 300 to 350 is a good number for high-speed rail in most countries. And that includes France, Spain, Japan, China, Taiwan, Germany, Italy, and UK. The definition by European Union is easy to achieve 200 to 150 kilometers per hour for upgraded ballast tracks. They have done a lot of experiments, a lot of field trials, and in France, up to 200 to 250 has been done by upgraded ballast track. That means they have changed the quality of the ballast a little bit. Maybe the sleepers are a little bit closer, a bit more confining pressure on track. 200 to 250 has not been a problem. So we are really looking at increasing that by only a 50 kilometers per hour for high-speed train. But that is where the problems are. You try to get that extra little bit, that's when the tracks get degraded, tracks get damaged. Records that have been set, the TGV on ballast track with 574 kilometers per hour. This was in 2007 on a ballast track, but it was done over a small distance by one train, not several trains going back and forth. So it's just a record, but you can't take that seriously because that's not true cyclic loading. Okay? Maglev can be designed for speed 500 kilometers per hour. Now that's a clever thing to do. If the soil conditions are very bad, then design a train that doesn't touch the ground, lifts up. So then there is no problem with the soft soils. And it will only come onto the track when the speeds become less than 200. So well, that's another way to go. But of course, maglev is a different thing. It's extremely high capital costs. The risk factors are much larger. There is no friction in maglev when the train lifts up. So if there's a derailment, you don't know where it's going to end up. So the European experience The French Railways launched the Train à Grande Vitesse TGV program in 1981, that's a TGV. In terms of the network size, the IC in Germany currently ranks 5th in the world. Britain's high-speed rail technology started in 1970, and Britain did high-speed rail research since 1960s. Before, they actually had the high-speed 2 over 300 kilometers per hour since the European Union and so on for between London and West Midlands. So it took Britain more than 20 years of constant research and development before they actually invented a high-speed rail. You can't simply do 1 or 2 years of research and think that you can get a high-speed rail done very quickly. Coming to the Asian experience, the Shinkansen in Japan started in 1959 and completed in 1964. If you look at the past Japanese records, the Japanese rail engineers were the pioneers in the Asian region. They started rail research in the 1940s. So they didn't just simply have those trains overnight. There was significant efforts going into research. Currently, we find China, South Korea, and Taiwan have now constructed HSR networks since 1980s. Australia and Malaysia were proved in principle, but reluctance by governments because of huge capital costs. Possible displacement of communities is a big issue in both Australia and Malaysia because you don't want to displace established communities. And that's a big issue. And if you are going to have tunnels, well, the cost is going to be 3 to 4 times more. So then you need to have budgets for that. What are the downside of this? The downside is competition with cheaper domestic air travel. At least in Australia, this is the biggest downside of high-speed rail. What if the high-speed train from Brisbane to Sydney and then Sydney to Melbourne is constructed maybe in the next 10 years, but people find that the airfares are still cheaper, and then nobody's going to take the train. You just drive to the airport, you pay $15 for parking, right? You buy a $59 ticket and then go to Brisbane. And somebody comes and picks you up when you at the airport. So then why do you want to take the train? Now these are genuine questions. So you need to answer them because you can bet that if in Australia there's going to be a high-speed rail, what would the airline companies do? They will decrease the airfares even more. That's what's going to happen. The HSR construction schedule in China has been accelerated since 2008 and several lines are due to be completed by this period, but mainly the maglev ones, magnetic levitation. So China is leading the way in magnetic levitation, and mind you, the magnetic levitation, the first one in Shanghai, was put by a German company, but the German government did not approve that to be put in Germany. So the first maglev was put in China, designed and built through German research and development company, but did not let that put in Germany. There are risk factors involved, and different countries think differently. Right, coming to Australia, this is the sad story of Australia. We started our high-speed rail research in 1980s. CSIRO had a major project on driving for high-speed rail. We tried to look at the models of the French TVD, but found the cost was enormous in Australia, politically not viable at the time. By putting the pie is constant, as we say in Australia. If you are going to put more money in rail, where are you going to cut down? Of course you are going to cut down on roads. You've got to probably cut down on airports. So then the other transport modes are going to protest. Or you've got to cut down on education, research, or health, or something like that. But sometimes you just can't do that because the costs are enormous. So it wasn't viable at that time at all. Then in 1986, very fast train, the VFT concept, was looked at and still found it to be uneconomical. Mammoth cost of ground improvement, tunnels, etc. Again, the idea was postponed. Then in 1993, again the government asked private companies to look at feasibility studies and an HSR corridor connecting Sydney to Canberra. Again, there were funding issues. The cost was mammoth, could not be afforded. Then now in 2013, at least in principle, The East Coast Link of Australia, Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne has been approved. We already spent $30 million just on feasibility studies. 2 years of feasibility studies cost $30 million, including some research that came to places like University of Wollongong through the Australian Research Council. Route already approved in 2013, expected cost 120 billion. And that track is line 1 is about 1,000 kilometers, line 2 from Sydney to Melbourne, bypassing the coast and going through inland, that's another 1,000 kilometers. So 2,000 kilometers, which means every kilometer of track costs $60 million. I mean, just think about it. 1 kilometer of rail track costs $60 million. And this cost is rising as we speak, because we are not going to build this track next year in 2014. It's going to go up to 10, 15 years down the track. And the inflation is always on the way up. So the cost is actually going to be more. So coming to just the key advantages of ballasted track. If you are looking at ballasted track, I'm not talking about slab tracks supported on large concrete piles. I'm not talking about maglev. What are the advantages of ballasted tracks? Lower construction costs and easy to design. You can train undergraduate students in the universities to design ballasted rail tracks. That's not a problem. You only have effective particle interlock, highly angular aggregates. As long as you have these materials, the basic soil mechanics can enable good undergraduates in the final year to do their thesis work on this kind of thing. It's not a rocket science. It's only a railway track. Facilitate rapid drainage of the track. If you have good quality ballast and good quality sub-ballast, a railway track can be designed to have rapid drainage, especially in countries that have heavy rainfall, like Thailand, Malaysia, Southeast Asian countries, and Australia in the eastern coast where we have a lot of rain. That is a very important aspect. You must have proper drainage. Easier to maintain and repair. If something goes wrong, you can dig it up, put new ballast in, you can put new concrete sleepers. Repairs can be done very quickly. Not if a slab track and the concrete slabs are cracked. It takes a long time to repair. What are the disadvantages of the ballasted track? The biggest disadvantage is the high quality rock quarries. Where do you find them? Can you find them? How efficient is it? And how long can you sustain them? And also how strong are the environmental groups in your country? Need for complex design on soft soils and frequent maintenance to rectify settlements. Countries where there are a lot of soft soils, compressibility, differential settlement is going to be the challenging part of design. And therefore that needs to be taken into account. Then of course you have the contamination of ballast. If you are carrying coal, like in Australia, then you have contamination of the track with coal. If your soft soil is very soft and liquefies and pumps up and pollutes the ballast, then you've got to look at that ballast fouling as well. So those are some of the disadvantages of these tracks. If you have slab tracks, what are the disadvantages of the slab track? Now those are slab tracks that have been designed on concrete slabs, very high capital cost. Initial construction costs are much higher than ballasted tracks. Structural precautions to avoid differential settlements and cracking of slabs. These are concrete slabs, there can be impact damage, there can be cracks. You have to regularly maintain and inspect for cracks, especially the connections between the slab and the columns. You need to look at that under impact load. Large changes or large alteration in track position and super elevation, especially at the bends, they are not easy to design and normally it involves substantial design effort. Adaptability to ground display. So if you are talking about soft soil terrains, a ballasted track can adjust itself. That is the advantage of a flexible pavement. Slab track is a rigid pavement. So the slab track is not as adaptable to large ground displacements, whereas ballasted tracks would be easily adaptable. In case of derailment of track, damage, repair works take more time for slab tracks compared to a ballasted track. So coming to the track technology, high quality ballast to reduce breakage is one of the most important part of it. You need sufficient confining pressure, and I'll touch on this a little bit later in my slides. You can reinforce the tracks using geosynthetics. Geosynthetics are quite cheap now. Thailand has a manufacturing plant for quite a number of geosynthetics, so that can be utilized very well. The shock pads are a new introduction in terms of energy efficiency. I will look at that in a little bit later. Effective track drainage, we need to cover that. The use of good sub-ballast and the geotextile filters below the ballast layer, and then of course the soft soil stabilization to increase the bearing capacity, stiffness and the dynamic resiliency, and that's particularly true in Thailand where you have a lot of soft soils. Now, in terms of facilities for universities to look at this, the first thing that you need to understand is you can't do railway testing with this little geotechnical equipment, okay? One particle itself is about that size. You can't fit 2 or 3 particles in a conventional equipment. So if you are going to seriously look at R&D work, research and development work at the universities, then you need to have the budgets to design large equipment like that. Now that's a large triaxial equipment. At the time in the 1990s, this was the biggest triaxial in the world. But now there are triaxial equipment in other universities and other research organizations which are even larger than that. Now that can do 300 millimeter diameter and 600 millimeter high samples. That's the largest cubical triaxial in the world still. And this was designed by me in 1996 and still working very well.